the etiology of sexually deviant behavior. So a couple of things to keep in mind. Again, we want to remember that sex offenders are not a homogeneous group of individuals. They're not similar, that they're instead a heterogeneous group with a variety of different reasons for offending and a variety of different types of offenses. No one factor can explain sexual offending, and no one theory can explain sexual offending. So let's start by looking at sexual disorders and paraphilias. So paraphilias are recurrent, intense, sexually arousing fantasies or urges. And generally, they often revolve around non-human objects or suffering or humiliation either of yourself, your partner, your children, or other non-consenting persons. And for some people, these fantasies are necessary in order for them to achieve arousal. This behavior, though, causes clinically significant distress and can impair people's social, occupational, and other areas of functioning. And most people who have one paraphilia suffer from more than one. So we're going to talk about 8 primary paraphilias, all that are in the DSM-4. And the DSM is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. Oh gosh, I'm not sure. But it's basically what psychologists and psychiatrists use to diagnose people. So we're going to go through these one by one. So first thing to think about is that most paraphilic acts, most of these behaviors don't come to the attention of law enforcement. They're often private and only come to the attention of the police when they become a habit, if they involve a crime or if they involve a victim. So many involve strangers and take place quickly, like if you think about something like exhibitionism, and victims rarely get a good look at the offender. Some don't even know they're subject to the abuse, like voyeurism. So voyeurism is when somebody is watching someone else engage in sexual acts. So someone who is like a peeping Tom. Some involve no contact, some involve minor contact, and some involve a great deal of contact and perhaps even violence. So let's start with the non-contact and minimal contact paraphilias. An exhibition is probably the most common non-contact paraphilia that comes to both people for treatment and for law enforcement's attention. This is almost exclusively a male behavior, and sometimes when the offender is exposing themselves, they're also masturbating. Other times they want to simply shock their victim, and some may even go so far as to fantasize that when they expose themselves, the stranger to whom they expose themselves is aroused. And then what may happen is they may go home and fantasize about that. They tend to engage in the behavior frequently and do so many times before they're ever caught or arrested. And this is the crime that has the highest known number of sexual offenses per offender. These types of people who suffer from exhibitionism or exhibitionists often experience loneliness and have intimacy deficits. They tend to show higher levels of arousal to consensual adult sexual relations than to exhibiting. And sexual needs are generally not the only motivating factor here. In fact, the primary motivation may be non-sexual in nature. Fetishism are sexual fantasies and urges involving non-living objects. So this is where someone might find sexual attraction, and it could either center on a behavior like stepping on bugs or body parts, which refers to partialism. Technically, these are not fetishes, but other types of paraphilias. Usually the object that someone has fetishized is required in order for the person to become sexually excited. And the most common objects involve clothes. This can be harmless or it could involve dangerous behavior. And there's some examples in page 47 of your text. There's also transvestic fetishism, and these are men who keep a collection of women's clothing and use it intermittently to cross-dress. While dressed as a woman, the man will usually masturbate and imagine he's the object of a sexual fantasy. This occurs only in heterosexual males, and for some it creates a real sense of peace of mind, while others are severely distressed about their need to engage in this behavior. Frotteurism is the touching and rubbing up against a non-consenting person. Again, this is almost exclusively male, and the person is usually fantasizing about having an exclusive relationship with this person. They may generally masturbate about the contact at a later date. This is the type of behavior that can occur in a place like the T pretty easily. And some people who are doing this may then pass it off as, like accidental. Voyeurism is the observation of unsuspecting individuals in the process of either taking their clothes off or engaging in sex. The person who is a voyeur is not seeking sexual activity with the victim, and they may masturbate while watching the person or later in response to the memory. Now let's look at the high contact paraphilias. pedophilia is the sexual attraction to prepubescent children. And this is an important distinction. The word pedophilia gets misused in the press and in the general public pretty regularly. So these are kids who have not gone through puberty. It's a recurrent, intense, sexually arousing fantasy, sexual urges, or behavior involving a prepubescent child over a period of time. The individual must be the person, in order to be diagnosed as a pedophile, you have to be at least 16 years old and at least 5 years older than the child. It's also important to know that not everybody who sexually abuses a child is actually a pedophile. And so that's one of the places where this term gets misused, because not all are driven by sexual needs. Also, not all pedophiles actually engage in sexual abuse. When we talk about someone who's attracted to adolescents, that's hebephilia. We can also talk about masochism and sadism. So masochism is when a person derives sexual excitement from the psychological or physical suffering of someone else, whereas sadism is where you derive pleasure from being humiliated, beaten, bound, or otherwise made to suffer. And these often increase over time. And many experience both of these paraphilias, which we would refer to as sadomasochism. This only comes to the attention of authorities when the violence results in some sort of negative outcome. So in 1992, there's an English case, including Brown and several others, and the police investigated 3 men who had videotapes of them performing S&M activities with 44 other men over a 10-year period. They did things like maim genitalia, branding, beating, using a cat o' nine tails. You guys might be familiar with a cat o' nine tails from corrections. It's an early form of punishment. It's a leather braided whip that then has like 9 whips at the end of it. This was consensual behavior that took place in private, but because of the extreme nature of the acts, the state had a right to intervene. It's also important to note that this is an English case and it may be handled differently here in the U.S. Autoerotic asphyxia is a dangerous activity where someone constricts the oxygen during masturbation by using a strangulation device. This is a behavior that's engaged in by both men and women. And basically what happens is the oxygen restriction leads to a sexual excitement, as does the ritualistic behavior. There's about 500 to 1,000 deaths per year that are actually due to this, but they're often mistaken for suicides or homicides. And this is a practice that dates back, over 1,000 years. Bestiality is any sexual activity with animals, and this is prohibited by law in the U.S. And this is not always or even often a paraphilia. To be a paraphilia, the person must have a sexual attraction to animals that fits the criteria of a paraphilia. But this is illegal in the United States regardless. Necrophilia is a sexual attraction to dead bodies. A pseudonecrophile is a fantasy necrophile. They fantasize about sex with dead bodies or only have sex with dead bodies periodically. They prefer their partner to be alive, but to pretend that they're dead. A regular necrophile regularly has sexual intercourse with dead bodies, and they may work in an occupation that grants them access to dead bodies. Homicidal necrophiles kill somebody in order to have sex with dead bodies, and Jeffrey Dahmer would be an example of this. Most sexual murderers do not engage in necrophilia. Most achieve their sexual gratification from killing the person, and this is often referred to as a lust murder. It's also maybe common for these murderers to masturbate over the body or insert a foreign object into the vagina or rectum, and this basically serves as a sexual substitution. There are some commonalities amongst lust murderers. They generally have an active fantasy life, which is both violent and sexual in nature. All right, so let's look at psychodynamic theories. So Freud uses the psychoanalysis network, and most of you guys should be familiar with Freud from criminology, but also those of you that have taken Psych 101. And Freud basically examined sexual deviancy using a psychoanalytic framework. His theories today are no longer widely supported, but it's always important to review theories that are no longer supported to really kind of have an understanding of how theory evolves over time. And he basically referred to individual sexual desires as perversions. He argued they were a consequence of deprivation in childhood, developmental fixation, or regression back to any one of those 4 stages of sexual development. Those include oral, anal, phallic, and genital. And basically what he says is that there's unresolved problems that bring about fixations during these stages of development. The first one would be the Oedipal complex, and boys could develop an Oedipal complex during the phallic stage. And This is where they feel like they're competing between their father. Where there's competition between the father and son for the mother's affection and attention. If boys do not resolve this during their development, they develop a permanent aversion to adult females whose appearance brings back their anxiety about castration. Castration anxiety refers to the fact that boys conclude that girls are actually boys whose fathers have cut off their penises. And penis envy is when girls are jealous of boys. So psychodynamic theory explains the interaction of three elements of the human psyche, and this is what Freud is probably most famous for: the id, the ego, and the superego. Recall that the id is your pleasure, your I want, your I need, driven part of your personality. Your superego is your conscience, and your ego is really your reality. Your ego is balancing between the I want and the superego part of your brain, part of your personality. Freud commonly believed that deviant behavior wasn't likely to go away and that psychopathology was a deeply rooted aspect of our personality. So treatment then would be lengthy and based on restructuring that character. In the 1980s, people proposed some family-based etiological explanations for sexually deviant behavior. So some people argued that it was a result of ill, absent, or sexually frigid moms who provide unsatisfying marriage for their husband. That this results in a loneliness and a need for intimacy, and the husband may turn to his children for the undemanding love he seeks. It's important to note, though, that all types of sex offenders show intimacy deficits and expression of loneliness, but this is insufficient to explain deviant behavior. Let's think a little bit about biological theories. So most biological theories are based on the assumption, hormone-based biological theories are based on the assumption that if you have abnormal hormone levels, that would adversely affect your sexual behavior. Sexual behavior, however, is multi-determined. Biological theories often address adult rape or sexual assault. It's important to remember that rape is an act of violence, and so some people are arguing that there's a correlation between aggression, and that aggression that would lead to rape or violence, and high levels of testosterone. Biological theories of child sexual abuse primarily concern abnormal hormonal and androgic levels in the brain. So the primary focus is the role here of androgens and androgen-releasing hormones in men. And secretion of those hormones is controlled by the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland. The anterior lobe of the pituitary gland carries the androgens to the testes, and the testes control the level of hormones released into the bloodstream. When the testosterone circulates, it may or may not be bound to proteins. If it's bound, androgen may become active if they come into contact with receptors for testosterone. This happens during puberty, and as a result, men experience physical changes in their body. The level of testosterone in the testes increases dramatically during puberty, and this also leads to an increase in the sex drive. So there's an implicit belief here that testosterone is the primary biological factor responsible for sex drive in men. Questions that remain to be answered, though, is there a connection between aggression and increased levels of testosterone? And if so, is that a result of hormonal imbalance? And would that hormonal imbalance then lead to sexual aggression? Aggression and sex do appear to be mediated by the same neural substrates that involve midbrain structures. So studies that they've done where they've looked at convicted felons, those especially with a violent history we do find that those who are convicted and have a violent history do have higher testosterone levels. But this is a tenuous connection, and we want to remember that whenever we're studying a population we already know to be violent, that's not really sound methodology. So what remains unclear is whether testosterone produces the aggression or simply causes an increase in muscle mass and strength, which allows people to be aggressive more effectively. So basically, studies that have been done trying to link testosterone and sexual aggression are largely conflicting. They often use small samples. They have mixed results. So most biological theorists conclude that the hormone imbalance still has to be triggered by some environmental or social learning factor. There's also this evolutional biological perspective of rape, and Thornhill and Palmer basically have put this idea out there, and they basically argue that men are driven to rape in order to reproduce. That rape then is an act of natural selection, and they support this by stating that most rape victims are within their prime years of reproduction. Unfortunately, this is kind of nonsense. Basically, this contradicts sociological research, and it really promotes rape myths. It's also unscientific and based on anecdotal evidence. And as I mentioned, it's nonsense. Let's look at some Feminist theories. Feminist theories focus on rape, and they emerge in the late 60s when it becomes evident that female victims were being persecuted in their cases. Most researchers at the time were men, and they were really focusing on victims' actions. Then we start to see an increase in the rate of reporting and the conviction of offenders. So Susan Brown Miller looks at rape in a cultural, political, and historical context. And she basically says sexual crime is an example of how men oppress women. And she thinks of sexual assaults as systemic to a patriarchal society. Theories have surmised then that the use of coercion to achieve sexual conquest is basically an exaggeration of prevailing norms. Essentially, that rape is a tool to dominate and control women. It's also seen as the consequence of deep-rooted social traditions. So men who commit sexual offenses are normal and rationalized through the epidemiological explanation that almost all sex offenders are male, and a notable proportion of the male population has committed a sex offense. So rape is basically a cultural as opposed to an individual problem, according to Brown Miller. Sexually aggressive men have been socialized to feel little need for intimacy and a low capacity for empathy. And sexual stereotyping, she argues, could also be used to explain child sexual abuse. That child sexual abusers are basically expressing sexual entitlement. They tend to be narcissistic and selfish and really only focus on their own desires and don't think about the harm they're causing with their actions. Attachment theories talk about how humans have a natural propensity to form emotional bonds to others. And this starts in infancy. And how we bond to people in infancy provides a framework for how we understand how we're attached to people in adulthood. So when we think about the development of our sexuality and our social competence, the most critical period here would be adolescence. An adolescent that has had appropriate parenting should have acquired pro-social behavior, including appropriate inhibitions on aggression and sexual behavior. Parents should also have instilled a sense of self-confidence and the ability to form emotional attachments to others. So, your first primary bond is going to be to your mother or whoever your primary caretaker is. And then our parents are basically modeling for us how we build relationships with other people. If this has been done appropriately, you should be able to appropriately develop effective relationships with age-appropriate partners. Those, however, with poor emotional attachments might be more likely to commit sexual offenses. So men who sexually abuse children tend to have poor social skills, little self-confidence. They really have difficulty forming intimate relationships with people their own age. And so they may be seeking intimacy with underage partners. 2 studies have showed that sex offenders have deficiencies in social skills that restrict the possibility of developing intimate relationships. They often misperceive social cues and don't act appropriately as a result. And this is common across different types of sex offenders. Rapists and non-familial child sex abusers have the most significant deficiencies in intimacy deficiencies. Insecure, attached individuals may try to overcome those feelings that they have of loneliness through sexual activity. And lack of experience with intimate relationships may result in empathy deficits, which then in turn lead to sexual offending. So basically what may be happening here is that they have some deficiencies in how they perceive, in their awareness and understanding of other people's beliefs, needs, and perspectives. And no matter what framework we look at, we tend to see a link between intimacy deficits and sexual offending. Bartholomew talks about 4 categories of attachment styles and argues that these explain our individual self-concept as either positive or negative, and that depends on the degree to which we believe we deserve to be loved. So the first attachment style is secure. This is where you have a positive concept of yourself and others. You can make friends and have age-appropriate relationships. And that is probably every single person in this class. Preoccupied are those with poor self-esteem and low self-confidence. They do have positive attitudes towards others and often need assistance to deal with personal matters. And this group is most likely to abuse a child. Fearful is a poor self-contempt and poor self-concept and concept of others. They tend to blame themselves for their problems, but they're too frightened to talk to others about it. And dismissing is a positive self-concept and a high level of self-concept. Negative concept of others and does not seek out help or support. So let's talk about behavioral and cognitive behavioral theories. These are based on the assumption that there's no single underlying problem that deviant sexual behavior is a symptom. And Abel takes an approach that's based on a model of etiology that's seen as underlying other disorders that are amenable to treatment through behavioral treatment. Deviant expanded upon this and classified deviant preferences according to what stimulated them and response characteristics. So sexually indulgent behavior displays a pattern that's entrenched and perpetuated by intermittent positive rewards. Wolff developed a 3-part theory. Sex offenders have a disturbed developmental history, the presence of disinhibitors that will allow deviant behavior to occur, and the offender has deviant sexual fantasies. These three work together to develop and maintain deviant sexual behavior. Cognitive behavioral therapies take into account the thoughts of offenders and their behaviors. So recall we've talked about cognitive distortions, and sex offenders, like most offenders, legitimize their behavior this way. They tend to push the blame from themselves, project it onto the victim or the environment, and these cognitive distortions allow them to engage in inappropriate sexual behavior. And then that deviant sexual arousal is learned through classical conditioning. If there's no adverse consequences for that behavior, an addictive pattern may be powerfully reinforced. So the offender assumes that children, like adults, are motivated by a desire for pleasure, and that then these children desire and enjoy sexual behavior. And then what happens here is the offender is more concerned with their desires and beliefs than those of the victim. The offender views other adults as abusive and perceives they will reject him in promotion of their own needs. And he also tends to think his environment is uncontrollable. Furthermore, they tend to believe that the sexual activity that they engage in with the child is beneficial to them and no harm is done to the victim. Psychosocial theories talk about deviant sexual behavior as a response to external factors, that there's an interconnection between psychological and sociological variables, and this interconnection is what influences sexual behavior. So basically, your sexual behavior is a learned response to particular conditions, and if you've been inappropriately socialized, the result may be deviant sexual behavior. So sex offenders have difficulty formulating normal adult relationships, and they're described as suffering from a courtship disorder. The terminal phase of courtship then is exaggerated and distorted, and pre-coital courtship is virtually absent. Rapists basically see violence as the only way to secure their goal of sexual gratification. So many sex offenders, as we've talked about, tend to misread social cues. They misread cues from their victims and interpret them as sexual in nature. So any overt symbol of affection is taken as a sexual cue. Remember we talked, I think, in one of the previous chapters about children, how children are sort of naturally affectionate, may sit on someone's lap. Sex offender may misinterpret that. They misperceive cues of social intimations. So they, engage in sex role stereotyping of women, and men are more likely to rape if given instructions or messages that behavior is acceptable. Other research has focused on the cycle of abuse theory, and there are statistically significant links between being victimized as a child and current sexual interest in children. But this doesn't account for the fact that more female than male children are sexually abused, and yet there are more male than female sex offenders. It also doesn't account for the fact that, while yes, many offenders have been abused, most people who are abused do not go on to become offenders. And many offenders were not sexually abused themselves. Routine activity theories looks at the role of our environment. And offenders basically could be prevented from abusing if they feel that the opportunity to commit the crime is too risky, if the reward isn't big enough, or if too much effort is required. So recall that routine activity says that there are 3 things necessary for a crime to occur. We need a motivated offender, a suitable target, and an absence of capable guardians. What this means then is we can use situational crime prevention strategies. We can use measures that reduce opportunities for offending. So this involves management, design, and manipulation of the immediate environment. This should then make the crime more difficult, risky, less rewarding, or excusable. Felsen and Clark talk about 4 opportunity-reducing techniques. So building upon that routine activities theory and those situational crime prevention techniques, basically we can increase the effort, make it more difficult or inconvenient to commit a crime. We can increase the risk involved in committing a crime. We can amplify the odds of being detected, and we do this mostly by providing appropriate guardianship. We can try to control prompts, which means to reduce situational triggers, and reduce permissibility. Make offenders understand their behavior is harmful to victims. This is something that's generally applied to property crimes, but we could apply some of this to sex offending as well. Wortley and Smallbone did an Australian study, and they found 7 factors that were consistent with the sexual explanation Situational explanation of child sexual abuse. A late onset of deviant behavior, low incidence of chronic sex offending, high incidence of previous non-sexual offenses, and then a low incidence of stranger abuse, networking among offenders, child pornography use, and paraphilic behavior. It's also important to think about location and the important role that that plays. So child sexual abuse is going to be pervasive in situations in which adults have unguarded access to children. So if you think about the sex abuse scandal in the Roman Catholic Church, part of the issue here was that these priests had unguarded access to children, that parents really implicitly trusted priests as religious men and often didn't believe what children were telling them. 20% of offenders that are outside of family report having accessed children via an organized activity. So this could be soccer, hockey, Boy Scouts. And 8% actually joined a youth organization for this primary purpose. And over 90% were aware of their sexual attraction to children prior to choosing their professional careers. Well, let's talk about theories that are integrated, where we take parts from more than one theory and put them together in empirical research. So the majority of offenders do not initiate sexually deviant behavior because of one variable. There's lots of interrelated factors here, and psychological, developmental, cognitive distortions. These are all going to play a role in how they interact together. Some claim the most important factor here is the strength of the bond between the child and the parent, because strong attachments help develop a resistance to deviant behavior. Children from unhappy homes are the most likely to accept and welcome attention and rewards that abusers may provide. They're most vulnerable, they're lonely, and they tend to develop a fear of intimacy, particularly in adult relationships. So integrated theories basically argue that experiences in childhood relationships provide the basis for our adult relationships. But they do also take into account some biological explanations. So let's think about this in terms of an example. Boys who have weak bonds, right, so they don't have strong attachments to other people, may not deal with stress or the changes that happen during puberty very well. And this in turn would make transitioning to adulthood difficult. Those with weak family bonds are vulnerable, and they may seek methods of power and control. They may turn then to violent relationships with children. Also, think about the availability of pornography today and the wide variety of pornography that's available. This encourages sexual stereotyping, and the media may also encourage deviant attitudes in already vulnerable adolescents. David Finkelhor is a researcher up at UNH, and he looked at a 4-factor model of preconditions for abuse. So basically, in order for someone to sexually abuse, they have to have a motivation to sexually abuse. They must want to abuse the child. And then they must overcome any inhibitions they have any inhibitions, anything that's there that would inhibit that behavior. They have to overcome external factors that may act as inhibitors. So basically create opportunities for the abuse to occur, and then emotionally manipulate the child to overcome their resistance to the abuse. Adults who sexually abuse children experience emotional congruence to children. They're often sexually aroused by children, and they have blockage to adult relationships. So basically, they don't have the ability to have their sexual and emotional needs met in adult relationships. They're often emotionally lonely and believe there's no other way of obtaining this pleasure. They have poor impulse control and fail to understand the damage they're causing. So this is a framework then that describes someone who is at risk to offend. And basically what happens is the sexual offending, the relief that's associated with that becomes reinforcing. It provides an emotional and physical response, and that reinforces that behavior. Traits connected to sexually deviant behavior are dynamic. So that means that they can change. Static variables don't change. The fact that you're a woman, the fact that you're a man, the fact that you're, there's certain characteristics about us that don't change. But dynamic variables include our cognitions, attitudes, and feelings, but they're less understood. Ward and Seigert present a pathway model, and they talk about how each distinct pathway has its own etiology, and they talk about 4 distinct pathways. Intimacy deficits, deviant sexual scripts, emotional dysregulation, and antisocial cognitions. And that wraps up this chapter.